Hi. Welcome to Everyday Movie Recap. For today, we will recap an action thriller film called Looper from the year 2012. Have you seen this movie yet? If not, sit back, relax, and enjoy. The movie begins during the year 2044, when we are introduced to a 25-year-old man named Joe. He works for a Kansas City crime syndicate as an assassin, or looper. The syndicate sends its opponents back in time to be executed because tracking technology in the year 2074 makes it almost hard to dispose of the dead secretly. Under the direction of Abe, a man from the future, loopers murder and dispose of victims, disguising their faces, and taking back silver bars that are fastened to their victims in exchange for money. Known as closing the loop, loopers who live until 2074 are sent back and executed by their own younger selves in order to conceal ties to the syndicate. The looper's contract ends when gold bars, rather than silver ones, are used to identify these targets. Later, Joe enters a diner by himself to get his coffee. He then takes his automobile to a store to get a fresh pack of Jeds for his GAT. The man offers the Jeds in return for the 2 silver bars, which he drops as payment. After some time, Joe discovers his friend Seth in an alley, where he is struggling to get his new dirt bike to start. As they make their way to La Bella Roar Bar, Joe offers to give him a ride. Then, after a short while, they go see Susie by going through the back door. Unfortunately, Susie informs him that she is occupied at work, so Joe meets his co-workers in place. Afterward, Joe abruptly awakens from his slumber due to persistent tapping on his glass pane. Joe then goes straight to the source of the noise and opens it. He is shocked to see Seth, who is confessing about his failed mission, running into his apartment. Joe discovers, as he listens, that Seth cannot kill his future self. Because the Rainmaker, a figure from the future, is mentioned by the elderly Seth as a warning to him. Additionally, that person will eliminate all loops and depose the 5 main bosses. Later, when Joe and Seth hear a tremendous thud coming from his door, they discover that Abe's elite GAT soldiers are trying to kidnap Seth. Seth then pleads with Joe to assist in hiding him. Joe reluctantly opens the floor safe in his apartment to conceal Seth from the GAT soldiers. Joe then unlocks his door, and Kid Blue bursts in, gesturing with his GAT to see if he can locate any evidence of Seth. Regretfully, he falls short. Then Kid Blue informs Joe that while his guys watch over his flat, he will speak with Abe. Joe visits Abe's headquarters later. When they start conversing, Abe threatens to take away half of the silver bars Joe keeps in his apartment if he doesn't find out where Seth is. Joe is reluctant to tell at first, but he eventually tells where he is since he needs the money. In other words, Joe doesn't really value his friendship with Seth. Instead, he chooses to preserve his silver bars. Abe's elite GAT soldiers leave the headquarters right away to apprehend Seth in Joe's apartment. After a few seconds, they manage to catch Seth. After that, they sever his bodily parts and slice an address into his arms with ferocity. As this is going on, old Seth's body begins to experience these effects, and rather than running away, he goes to the place that is tattooed on his arm. Unfortunately, no sooner had he entered the designated spot when Kid Blue shoots him. Joe tells Susie the tale of his friend's passing because he feels unworthy. He acknowledges that he permitted Seth's murder for silver. Joe even promises Susie that if she leaves the city with him, he will give up half of his silver bars. Susie, however, declines his offer, claiming she already has a job that provides for her necessities and she doesn't need it. Susie declines to become Joe's wife and to spend the rest of her life with him. Joe reaches his target spot the next day. Then, as he gets ready for his next target, he watches for the ticking of his clock. Joe realizes in a flash that it's his older self, but his hands are free and his face is uncovered. He aims to the old him but the guy does a surprise attack on him and escapes. After some time, Joe awakens from sleep and discovers a note with the words, "Hop onto the train out of town and run," taped to his shirt. However, Joe dismisses it and dashes back to his flat. When Joe returns to his apartment a time later, he discovers that the Gatmen are searching for his silver bars by breaking into the floor safe. Joe quickly makes his way over there and traps Kid Blue inside. He then deals with the remaining Gatmen while making an attempt to get away. However, he abruptly trips over a fire escape and passes out. As per Abe's recommendation, he uses the silver bars he earned from the crime syndicate job. After moving abroad, Joe then turns to a hired killer to support his lavish lifestyle and drug addiction. Joe decides to use violence in order to survive because he is running out of bars. He eventually finds and marries the love of his life. With the support of his partner, Joe overcomes his drug addiction and undergoes personal transformation. However, a stunning incident happens 7 years later when Joe's wife is killed by captors who break into their home. In order to complete the loop, they then apprehend Joe. Joe takes himself back to 2044 after defeating his captors. Then, in order to escape with young Joe, he starts his plan by changing his past. Looking back to 2044, old Joe has hazy recollections of what he did in the present. He believes that he suffers whenever young Joe suffers. Later, in a convenience store, old Joe purchases a pack of medications for himself. He then discovers Joe returning to his flat. Old Joe has no choice but to prevent the death of his younger self. After killing the final Gatman, elderly Joe curses Joe for his foolish actions. In the meantime, Joe, both young and old, is going to be captured by Abe and his elite Gatman. At the same time, old Joe uses the sophisticated computer at the local library to look up the numbers printed on his palms. Then he prints the whereabouts of 3 infants he believes to be the Rainmaker. Old Joe runs across his younger self in a diner the next day. He then takes a seat at the table and converses with his younger self. As they are experiencing one another's intensity, a young woman approaches them and requests food. After that, Joe starts receiving insights from old Joe about what lies ahead. Subsequently, he reveals his scheme to rewrite history by assassinating the Rainmaker in his youth. Old Joe will prevent his wife's death in this way. While Joe is listening, old Joe pulls a map out of his pocket. Through the map, he identifies the possible locations of the Rainmaker, but Joe humbly requests to differ from old Joe's intentions. When he does, he learns that old Joe feels compelled to do it in order to protect his wife from the future. They both realize that things must be handled and that he can't allow old Joe to leave the cafe alive, even if Joe admits that it might be a difficult scenario for him. Subsequently, old Joe dares to pull out his gun and murder him. Joe follows his dare, but he ignores it and keeps hearing more warnings from old Joe. Later on, Joe learns that the captors kill old Joe's wife. However, he claims that none of it matters to him. The elder Joe then predicts that he will experience it, but Joe cuts him off and declares that he will wed a different woman to avoid it. To make sure he won't meet that woman, Joe even requests to see her photos, but old Joe declines to comply. Joe agitates him further, leading to a shootout between them inside the diner. Kid Blue and the Gat Men show up as the shootout erupts. They eventually go after old Joe, but after chasing him across the field, they are unable to capture him. After that, Kid Blue understands they also need to apprehend Joe. Thankfully, both Joes manage to flee with fragments of the map. Joe then goes to a farm owned by Sarah and her small son Sid after following the coordinates on the map. Sarah is cooking when she hears noises from outside. Joe is there, but Sarah does not know him, so she grabs up her shotgun and gives Joe the order to turn away. Joe, however, hides inside and won't show himself. Once night falls, Joe feels as though he should go away, but he makes an effort to remain composed to keep himself from losing it. He sees Sarah outside aiming the gun at someone and he believes Sarah is having trouble. Joe is forced to intervene and prevent Sarah from getting into trouble with a beggar who is requesting food. Following that, Joe pukes while Sarah slaps him to wake him up. She then gives Joe some water to rehydrate. The next morning when Joe wakes up, he discovers that he is handcuffed. Then, however, Sid lets Sarah know that he's awake. Sarah grabs a shotgun and heads out the door to check on Joe in the barn before even starting to make breakfast. Sarah then gives Joe the key so he may remove his handcuffs. Joe, however, gives Sarah the map and won't leave her farm. Sarah picks up the paper and begins to study it when she realizes that Sid's birthday and the location of the hospital where he was born are represented by the numbers on the map. Joe gets shot twice by Sarah without hesitation. Sarah questions Joe about his plan while she reloads her gun. Then Joe claims that although time travel hasn't been discovered yet, large criminal organizations will use it within the next 30 years. Sarah cuts Joe off as she's listening. Joe acknowledges that she believes him to be a looper. Joe informs her that the old him will kill all 3 of the children born at that hospital on the same day, without knowing which one will become the Rainmaker. In the meantime, old Joe shoots his first victim with extreme brutality. After killing an innocent child, he then breaks down in tears. Days go by at Sarah's house as they wait for old Joe to arrive. Joe honors his promise to keep Sarah and Sid safe. At that point, Joe and Sid are growing closer and Sid is becoming more at ease with him. In the end, Sid admits to Joe that Sarah has been lying to him and that he knows what really happened to his birth mother. A Gatman appears the next day. He approaches her and her family members inside the house, requesting some water. Without any other option, Sarah repays his kindness by speaking with him afterward. Sid's grandfather's tunnel serves as a successful hiding place for him and Joe in the interim. Later that evening, once Sarah admits that she possesses telekinetic abilities. By that, she implies that Sid also inherited the ability from his parents. Although Sarah is technically Sid's birth mother's sister, she guides him in controlling Sid's powers to keep him from danger. Because Sid's powers are even stronger than hers, Sarah is attempting to keep him out of trouble. When Joe awakens in the morning, he finds Sarah being held at gunpoint by Jesse. Later, when Joe tries to have a peaceful conversation with Jesse to get Sarah released, Jesse unintentionally shows Sid the pistol as soon as he sees him upstairs. Then, Sid abruptly collapses below, and Joe reaches out to grab him. Sid, however, is only slightly hurt. Sid uses telekinesis to kill Jesse, terrifying the crowd, while Sarah nudges Joe outside so they may both escape. Then Joe realizes that old Joe will be aware that Sid is about to turn into the Rainmaker. Joe yells out at Sarah, asking whether Sid killed her sister after she tells him everything. Joe pushes her. Next, Sarah says that Sid fell while trying to climb a bookshelf. Following that, Sid loses control of his uncontrollable powers and erupts out of fear, slaying his mother. Joe instructs Sarah to accompany Sid to the city right away so that they can avoid being discovered by old Joe. Old Joe is taken to Abe by Kid Blue, who has captured him, but when they go to Abe's headquarters, old Joe escapes. At that point, old Joe attacks and murders Abe and his men. Old Joe then proceeds to kill Sid on Sarah's farm. Little does old Joe know, though, that Kid Blue follows him after escaping the headquarters. Furthermore, Kid Blue uses the slat bike to kill both Joes. But Joe gets to him first before he can kill them. Old Joe then catches Sarah and Sid on the road. Sarah panics and tells Sid to run as Joe is still far away. Joe starts shooting at old Joe. Unfortunately, Sarah gets shot. The angered Sid starts to summon his powers once more, but Sarah calms him down before he can unleash his full power. In order to get out of old Joe's sight, Sarah sends Sid into a field. However, Joe notices them from a distance and knows that if old Joe murders Sarah, Sid will turn into the Rainmaker. Thus, in order to put an end to everything, Joe shoots himself to death in order to make old Joe disappear. The movie ends with Joe finally ending his own loop. But, he managed to change the future as Sarah is still there to guide Sid from becoming the future Rainmaker. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoy this movie. See you on our next video.